officializing pilgrimage sites was a really huge deal, right? Because it even on churches and cathedrals on the way to places in the Holy Land, if you could get pilgrims to stop at your church in your city and not down the road, it would be a great boom for income, for making money. And so things like, as you said, like relics and claims to the true cross and other things were ways to kind of attract, and bits of saints and things like that were ways to attract pilgrims to come to your church and not to other ones. And so the Franciscans, there's throughout the 17th, 18th century, there's big conversations, because this is the Ottoman Empire really is in charge politically of much of that region, but they kind of are petitioned frequently by Catholic sects to have control over the holy sites, and the Franciscans basically become the traditional custodians of Jerusalem. And very quickly, pilgrimage is of course an important devotional practice, but it's also, as you said, it's also a commercial practice, and those two things run in parallel. I mean, sometimes they run upsettingly in parallel. In the 19th century, for example, when middle class British tourists, British class pilgrims start going to Jerusalem, some of them are quite astonished by the fact that this scene they've read about in the Bible is full of people trying to sell you shit, But a big part of that is marks that you've been, and so the non-tattooed version of that is what's called pilgrim badges. So I can ask listeners to Google those, but they are essentially the kind of pewter or metal, or sometimes more fine, in more extravagant versions, basically kind of badges to show that you'd been on a pilgrimage. And it was something that you could bring back home with you. There are various Bible verses about taking some place of taking Jerusalem into your heart, and this would be a little proxy. And of course, tattooing, A, because it can't get lost, B, because it has that kind of spiritual resonance of being with you permanently, becomes very quickly a part of the trade. Now, Christian tattooing goes back a very long way. We've got, for example, an 8th century mummy, another British Museum mummy, actually, from Sudan, who has a St. Michael image or kind of mark on her inner thigh. So there's Christian tattooing right in the early North African Christian tradition. And so the Copts, as part of those traditions, I mean, also there's indigenous, like Bedouin, for example, North African tattooing as well, both visible in Jerusalem and in North Africa. So those tattooers who've learnt to tattoo and begun tattooing in Egypt and in North Africa move to Jerusalem and basically set themselves up essentially as a kind of service to tattoo visitors. Now, there is some interesting, there's at least one account in the Old Bailey records of an Englishman getting arrested for housebreaking, who is doing, quote unquote, the Jerusalem mark back in London. So this is a practice that sort of exports itself from Jerusalem as well. I reckon at the moment that guy might be the oldest recorded English tattooer in the world, right? This housebreaker from London. As far as kind of professional tattooing on European bodies is concerned, we can really take this pilgrimage moment as definitive. I mean, there are pilgrim tattooers also in other pilgrimage sites like Loreto in Italy, a very kind of key site of Catholic pilgrimage, but Jerusalem, and to a lesser extent Bethlehem and Nazareth, is what we're talking about here. The image, let me read you, because I think this is a good example of what this is involved. So we heard from Carswell there about these blocks, and the designs were essentially carved into. We don't have paper or stencil or transfers, so the Razouks and clearly others carved their designs into these olive wood stamps, and they were everything from the standard design, which is called a Jerusalem cross, which is a big cross in the middle and 4 crosses around it, symbol of the Franciscans. It symbolizes proselytization of Christianity, basically, right? One big, from Jerusalem, the main cross, outwards go these other crosses. So that's a very common design. But we also have lots of saints. St. George, for example, is very popular. There are images, of course, of Mary. There are images of various miracles, images of various pieces of architecture around the cities of the pilgrimage sites as well, like the Dome of the Rock, for example, or the Holy Sepulchre. So these blocks are the way that we have the designs, and you go and essentially you'd have some kind of some flash, I guess we'd call it, really equivalent. But you'd also be able to customize it. Many of these guys, and it really is all men, have their dates of their pilgrimages tattooed on them. So this is starting, and we'll come to the earliest ones in a second, but this is starting in the late 1500s, and it really kicks in the early 1600s. So the design is done by blocks. It's pricked over with a series of hand needles. And I want to read you this. This is from 1658. It's from a French pilgrim called Jean de Thévenot. And he's also going at Easter. And he basically describes the process. And this would have been pretty consistent, really, from as early as 1600 right the way through to the birth of electricity, I suppose. So Jean de Thévenot, who's a French pilgrim, says, quote, there are several wooden molds. Getting marks put upon our arms as commonly all pilgrims do. The Christians of Bethlehem do that. They have several wooden molds of which you may choose that which pleases you best. Then they fill it with coal dust, apply it to your arm, so they leave upon it the same mark of what is cut in the mold, like potato block printing, right? Like you'd have at primary school. After that, with the left hand, they take hold of your arm and stretch the skin of it. And in the right hand, they have a little cane with 2 needles fastened in it, from which time to time they dip into the ink, mixed with ox's gall. So that's like the bile of an ox, and prick your arm all along the lines that are marked by the wooden mold. This, without doubt, is painful and commonly causes a slight fever, which is soon over. The arm, in the meantime, for 2 or 3 days, continues swelled 3 times as big as it ordinarily is. After they've pricked all along the said lines, they wash the arm and observe if there be anything wanting. They then begin again and sometimes do it 3 times over. Like even like 350 years ago, Tom, tattooers are like going, "Oh, I've just missed a bit. We're nearly finished. We're nearly done.
Just got to do the white."
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. So they begin again and sometimes 3 times over. When they've done, they wrap up your arm very straight and there grows a crust upon it, which falling off 3 or 4 days after, the marks remain blue and never wear out because the blood mingling with the texture of ink and ox's gall remains the mark under the skin. So that's like basically exactly the same as getting hand poke tattooed now, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I was going to ask, because obviously when we talk about like different regions or different periods, I'm always like curious about what ink they're using. And obviously you mentioned it there, like were they just like mixing the ox's gall with coal dust, like just as a mixture and like tattooing it into the skin?
That's it. Yeah, that's basically it. So the bile is essentially sort of sterile, right? Because it's come out of the inside of an animal. It's going to work as a suspension, and you're going to use this kind of carbon ink to be able to produce the tattoo. And like I've joked about this before, but I really wish at tattoo conventions, like as I've said before, there was a period. It still sort of happens really sometimes. Go to a tattoo convention and you'll see Samoan and Tahitian and New Zealand tattooers in their kind of traditional clothing doing very traditional tattooing. I want to see a guy doing this. I want to see a guy in a fez with his like pop down to the butchers, get yourself some ox gall and get doing that old school shit. Authentic old school shit.
For some reason you strike me as a man who owns a fez.
I don't own a fez. Actually, I should get a fez, really. I should get myself a fez. Yeah, I don't know. Like, don't you think like we should reclaim old school? Like, old school should only refer to this from now on.